Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cloud Security Unlocked Visibility, Protection, and Control webinar. Appreciate everyone being here. Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening to our attendees. So we will jump right in here. Uh, Take a look at kind of the overall agenda for today, some of the key focus areas that we are going to be covering, do a little introductions about ourselves, and then, as always, questions are definitely encouraged throughout the presentation. So if you have anything on your mind as we're going through the various topics around Defender for Cloud, please feel free to enter those into the chat window. We'll be monitoring those in the background, and we can address those where it makes sense during the presentation, or at the end for sure we'll have time to do that as well. So as far as today's agenda goes, we really want to set the tone with Defender for Cloud and kind of understand what we're seeing, with our clients within the industry around cloud security overall in that landscape, some of the threat vectors that we're seeing, why it's changed, visibility aspects that we'll go into as well. Then we'll jump into what Defender for Cloud does, some of its core capabilities and its business value overall. We'll take a look at some actual illustrative scenarios and real world impact type of conversations, and then understand, kind of next steps, where Netrix Global can help out from next step perspective. And then again, if we have should have enough time for our questions and answer session. So we'll jump right in here. So want to introduce ourselves. So my name is Chris Clark. I am one of our field CTOs on our Office of the CTO team. So I'm focused on cybersecurity. Have a larger team called Office of the CTO that covers a lot of technology pillars, AI, digital workplace, network security, cloud. So a larger team that helps with strategic road mapping with our clients. And I've been an IT consultant for about 20 plus years, but then focusing on Microsoft security specifically for the last decade plus. So also have along with me is Jeff Rostis. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, Jeff Rostis here. I'm a principal security architect here at Netrix, part of our security team. So unlike Chris, who kind of handles a lot of the advisory side, I'm more of the implementation. So I help a lot of our clients deploy our security solutions, a lot of the Microsoft tools. I've been at Netrix here for 15 years. I've been working in Microsoft security that entire time. Thanks for joining our webinar.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, so we'll jump right in and then talk about kind of the overall landscape, kind of some of the items that we're seeing again in the industry at our clients as well. So as we start talking about Defender for Cloud, Jeff, you could move to the next slide. Sorry. There's a couple critical areas. Even recently, there's one in particular of a breach that was public information. So I'm not sure if a lot of people have seen it recently, but there was a large pharmaceutical company that essentially had the operational aspect of their business come to a screeching halt, if you will, right, from a compromise. So it's very interesting and to think about, some of the standard types of threat vectors that we see in the environment. But this one was, I'd say, kind of a new scenario where wasn't direct breach of ransomware in that case, or malware from that perspective, but it was more of an identity breach, if you will. So there was compromised identities that led to lateral movement potentially between systems that ultimately had admin roles that were compromised, and had Intune admin access at the same time. So what happened is that the enrolled devices in Intune were actually wiped from that perspective. So very concerning kind of new type of attack, but realistic. And some of the items that we're talking about here are around the resources within the cloud. But there's also kind of the zero trust model that we'll talk about specifically around the identity that is one of the pillars in zero trust, the devices that are accessing these resources. Everything has to be taken into account from a security strategy perspective, right? We can't concentrate on, as an example, Defender for servers, which is part of Defender for cloud, if we're not looking at identity controls at the same time, or other device controls, storage controls, IoT. We'll see that there's different Defender capabilities across all these different areas. And some attendees on the call might also be familiar with Defender XDR, right, from the Microsoft 365 side. So it becomes a much larger story from a security perspective, kind of a defense in depth, zero trust conversation. But one of the key areas here is this, it's a board level agenda item from that perspective, right? So a type of breach like that is not only operational impact, reputational impact. So if you're working with clients or even your own employee information that could get leaked from that perspective, all these are real risks, to the business from that perspective. So one of the other areas here that we're seeing a trend in is really just cloud adoption overall, right? We're working with a lot of clients that really don't want to. Sorry, Jeff, you go back. That really don't want to manage their data centers anymore, right? Maybe move to Azure or other cloud services, or even look at things like intra-joined only devices, right? So even the device landscape is changing and how it accesses those potential cloud services. So I feel I'm seeing a trend in that and working with clients on a daily basis and having those conversations. We also work with a lot of organizations on kind of M&A activity and also divestiture conversations. So especially divestiture where you can say, do we need this infrastructure, right? If we're breaking off from a larger entity, it's time to kind of rethink those things. But at the same time, you're going to need different ways of thinking about security with that scenario. So one of the other key areas is just the visibility across all these different areas, right? I started to talk about kind of zero trust mentality that can go across, identity, apps, devices, cloud is when we're talking about cloud resources from that perspective, data, AI, right? There's a lot of different areas to concentrate on, a lot of signals from those areas. So you really need kind of a single pane of glass. You need a holistic type of security platform to be able to see across these areas, see the integrations, have that incident response capability in an effective manner versus maybe potentially, disparate kind of tools that are in the environment. So these are some of the key areas, that we're seeing, I would say, from a conversational standpoint and working on the advisory side. And as we kind of get a little more detail, if we go to the next slide there, thinking about some of the legacy security components with cloud adoption, it's at a scale that's kind of never been seen before. So you have operational aspects of do you allow users to spin up cloud resources? What is the visibility and governance around those? Those are one of the key areas. There kind of an automated baseline, a consistent baseline of how things are deployed. So we're going to mention the term kind of shift left security throughout the presentation. And the idea behind that is to bring security at the forefront and those conversations at the forefront before things get deployed, even from a DevOps perspective or just in general, having security in those conversations with the right teams in your organization in front in your design phase, in the build phase, in the pilot, and throughout. So if you are reactive to security, right, that puts you in a bad position where those not best practices, if you will be incorporated into how things are developed, how things are deployed, right, and later on lead to those types of vulnerabilities. So an area that we'll see where Defender for Cloud can definitely help with that is having the visibility into the early process of the design aspect, building it out, and then deploying based on those baselines. And then ultimately what I mentioned was the fragmented tools. So if you have different kind of best of breed mentality for different tools. How can you correlate signals between those tools? How can they see across the different technology domains or even cyber domains that we're talking about, including kind of those zero trust pillars, as I mentioned. So having a centralized detection, SIM capabilities that can look across these different areas is key. Either it be, hybrid cloud, as we're talking about, Microsoft 365 side, other SSO apps, everything is kind of part of this bigger picture when we're talking about security. Next slide, please. So what we started to allude to is kind of misconfigurations, right? And early in the process of deploying resources, maybe developing applications. That's one of those key areas that we'll talk about in detail here today. But that's that shift left, as I said, kind of mentality around security. So having the right security teams involved across all those different domains from the beginning, making sure that there's not overall misconfigurations that will fall into the deployment of those resources. But then there's also potential vendor supply chain weaknesses as well. So we'll talk about something like infrastructure as a code and templates like that, or open source resources that developers could typically use, or admins in your organization. They bring in these tools, but these tools haven't been fully vetted. They might be compromised. That's kind of another starting point that we want to be potentially concerned with, right? And bring into our overall security strategy here. Again, key pieces that we'll see is one of the key themes here is disconnected tools, right? Creates the fragmented kind of data sets that you're working with from an incident response perspective. Slower remediation leads to slower remediation potentially. So those are all things we want to address with tools like Defender for Cloud, Defender XDR, potentially even Microsoft Sentinel as well from an overall SIM perspective. So not only are we talking about resources that could be misconfigured, but still the fundamental items or pillars or domains, if you will, around like identity. So we'll talk briefly again about zero trust here next, but having phishing resistant MFA in front of your administrators that are administrating these resources in Azure, other cloud services, even Microsoft 365. No longer is standard Microsoft Authenticator cutting it, right? There's man in the middle attacks. Attackers can easily trick a user into logging into a web page that looks exactly like an M365 login page, or maybe an Azure portal, whatever the case may be. And the user goes through the MFA response, everything looks fine, it's in Microsoft Authenticator, but now they can actually intercept that token, replay it as if they're that user. If you don't have the tools to detect that, or even really more of a hammer approach, which would be defend against it, which would be the phishing resistant MFA as a best practice. So there's not even talking about Defender for storage, Defender for cloud, CSPM, all the fundamental things that we'll talk about today. Identity is at the door, right? So that's one. If you forget about that, then you're really kind of relying on reactive measures right after that. So just want to stress that we got to look across all these different areas. There's no silver bullet to security, as I'm sure everyone knows, but I think identity is a good example of if you're using FIDO2 tokens or passkey and authenticator, maybe certificate auth, that is authentication that is tied to the device itself. So that token interception scenario is a moot point, right? And then there's other signals that you can get across the Defender workloads that will help react to that in real time. So all that really just brings the overall kind of contextual insights into everything that we're talking about. So Defender for Cloud can help see across all these different areas. We have Defender XDR, and you just kind of start to see the consolidated tooling perspective, right? And having that information be able to be at the ready, and also to be able to be correlated between the different systems, between identity, between devices. And that's kind of the larger picture that we're going for. So lastly, if we move forward, um, just talking about zero trust, because I mentioned it a few times. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about because everyone thinks identity, as I was mentioning, but it goes across so much more, right? This defense in depth type of mentality here. So zero trust at a high level, verify explicitly. You're no longer using, say named locations as a conditional access policy, as an example. Um, you're not just trusting explicitly, you're verifying explicitly based on various signals that can come across. Using least privileged access, right? This goes into exactly what we were saying about not only having phishing resistant MFA for, say, your admins, but also least privilege. So, using something like privileged identity management across Azure or even M365, being able to elevate to those administrative roles versus having them as static roles as a best practice. And then we have to assume breach, right, from a security perspective. Again, there's no silver bullet. The phishing email is going to get through no matter how many, secure email gateways you have. You're going to have other controls. But as we can see on the right here, there is ultimately, these technology domains that go across zero trust that we're talking about. So, thinking through a scenario that phishing resistant MFA in front of administrative portals that lends into the identity components here. What devices are your developers using to access cloud resources, or your administrators, right? How are those controlled? Is there a zero trust mentality to those? Maybe saying you can only access various resources from compliant devices, as an example. Um, Ultimately, data as well, right? So if there's sensitive data that can be exfilled from a breach scenario, right? That's one of the number one concerns. You have data security, data governance, including AI as its own pillar now, right? So we have Copilot, we have other Gen AI tools that sensitive data can be going to. So it's just a much larger story. It can go on for a little too long, but want to kind of set the stage that when we're thinking about security and we see some of the features here coming up with Jeff Rostis, we can kind of think back to these zero trust pillars and see how they're related to that. So um, with that said, I will hand things off to Jeff Rostis here, and he'll continue on.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as Chris added up there, you kind of saw what we're looking at nowadays as far as the security landscape, right? The kind of major thoughts that we're going through as companies dealing with all the cybersecurity that we're seeing as far as attacks and the approaches that are being taken nowadays. I want to give you a little bit more of a technical overview of Defender for Cloud. Defender for Cloud is rather large, so we're going to kind of narrow it down to a couple of topics. But I think one of the key things to know about Defender for Cloud is how it integrates into that XDR scenario. So as Chris was saying, if you're familiar with Defender already, if you're an E5, if you're using the stack already, you know how it brings things together. It brings all that telemetry together, all the alerts together, correlates between them. What we want to have is to have Defender for Cloud give us that information into that extended detection and response from our applications, from our cloud resources, from our infrastructure that maybe we're not getting right now. So think about all this in context of adding information, adding telemetry to your total security graph that you have. So what I'm going to do, as I said, Defender's rather large, but we'll break it down to about 5 categories. So kind of the 5 major capabilities that Defender for Cloud provides us. So we'll go through each of these. First being how Defender is a proper CNAPP. Second is our continuous posture management. So we're watching, how our systems are deployed, how our services are running, if there's any flaws or exploits out there. Cloud workload protection, something you may be more traditionally familiar with. So things like server protection, but also extending also to our storage and some other tools as well. We'll talk a little bit about DevOps and that shift left idea that Chris had brought up earlier. Really talking about taking our security earlier than production, right? So how do we get security in front of our deployment cycle? And then finally, really how Defender for Cloud is multi-cloud capable. really can be the single pane of glass. That's what we're all going for here, is to have all that telemetry brought together. Also makes it a lot easier for our admins and security folks when things have a single interface. We're not bouncing around to a bunch of different platforms. So we'll start with number one here. I'm just talking about Defender for Cloud as the Microsoft native CNAPP. Now, if you're not familiar with the acronym, CNAPP is a Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. Large set of words there. Really, what's talking about is unifying that security posture for when we're doing development or deploying our infrastructure as code. So you can kind of look through the points here. We want to integrate our DevOps and our production deployments, as well as our dev deployments here, across any clouds that we have, whether it's one or multiple cloud environments. We want to make sure that the security goes hand in hand, really doesn't provide friction for our deployments, making sure that our workflow is repeatable, that is correctable over time. We want to also make sure that we have reduced complexity. We want things to be deployed the same, with the same tools across different departments, different groups. We can use policies and things like that to pull that in. And then also there's a new factor that we've been seeing a lot lately is AI. How do we handle that? We're seeing a lot of AI development, not just people using it in their emails and things anymore. We're developing with AI. We're developing agentic platforms for both inside and outside of our businesses. So how do we watch those and how we keep an eye on those, including monitoring prompts and what kind of access they have. So drilling in a little bit more on number one, this is really where we lay out this idea of a CNAPP. A lot of acronyms here. I'll give you the quick rundown in case you're not familiar. I'll start on the left side, enabling secure development. We're talking about AppSec, or application security. That means possibly scanning our code, watching what sources we're pulling things in from. Chris mentioned open source is often often a area to watch when we're integrating that into our production environment. So AppSec there. CI/CD. CI is continuous integration, continuous deployment, or continuous development, depending on how you approach it. Meaning that most of our environments nowadays are, if not fully agile, it's at least iterative. And something we also see a lot crossing over into our infrastructure as well, right? So it's not just the applications; it's the underlying cloud infrastructure written as code. You may be doing infrastructure as code already. If you're not, something to look towards, as it is a much more secure way to handle things. So that's really kind of where we handle that on the development side. So getting the shift left, getting ahead of the, even before it's rolled out, make sure that things are produced in a secure environment. We also then look to continuously reduce risk. So we're looking at the top there. CSPM, that one you might be more familiar with, Cloud Security Posture Management, and KIM or KEEM, CIEM, separating it from what you might have heard as a SIEM, SIEM for Security Information Management, something like Sentinel or another log collector. We talk about KIM or KEEM, depending on how you want to say it, is Cloud Identity Entitlement Management. So not just our identity out of Intra, but how does it integrate with the cloud? It could be internally within the company, could be privileged elevations, our administration, of course, but also could be our end users as well. So how do we deal with those identity enablements here? Over on the right side, then we're also talking about remediating our threats faster. Very familiar, again, if you're in the Defender suite already, you know about your EDR, you know about your protections. This is the cloud protection. So CWP, Cloud Workload Protection, and CDR, Cloud Detection and Response. So just like our EDR as well on the endpoint side. And this is where we integrate all three of these as part of Defender for Cloud. One thing to note there at the bottom, this does cover multi-clouds. We'll come back to that in a bit, but just note that we're talking about AWS, Azure, and GCP, Google. And then we're talking about DevOps. We're also integrating here with Azure DevOps, of course, but also GitHub and GitLab as well. So full integration there for Defender for Cloud, regardless of which cloud or which operations tool you may be using there. When we look at the CNAPP platform, one of the things we're trying to pull together is prioritizing our security, right? So a couple of major points here we look for is pinpointing and remediating risks. So one, can we quickly identify what's wrong? And then make sure that we are aware of what potentially is going to be an attack path, what's going to be flawed, where we might have some lateral movement. So looking for those and correcting them as quickly as possible. We want to unify our security standards, right? So We could possibly align to a public standard, CIS, something like that, or Microsoft standards. We could also build our own custom standard, but how do we make sure that those are deployed the same? How do we make sure that all of our resources are using and following those protocols? This is what Defender for Cloud does. It monitors those things, allows us to put policies in place, allows us to give alerts when things fall out of our specified range. We want to fortify sensitive data across our clouds. As Chris mentioned before, data is a big factor here. As we have more of our infrastructure on the clouds, as our users are accessing more cloud resources, we want to make sure that those are protected on the data side as well. So if you're already perhaps using Purview or other data classification, we want to integrate that into our application and infrastructure development. So maybe we have files out on an Azure storage point, or we're having data within a database that we need to track and make sure is protected. It could be personal information, could be financial data. Defender for Cloud is going to help us with that by integrating those information labeling as well as protections around data loss prevention and data exploitation. And also, we want to make sure we want to prevent future risks by fixing as code. This brings back to that shift left idea, meaning that when we have these things that break that we're fixing or we're improving our security stance, we want to make sure that's integrated into our full deployment. We don't want to spot fix this out in production. We want to integrate this into the whole workflow before it even gets deployed, and that way we can constantly iterate. So just a couple of major items here. Our second major point I wanted to bring up here was about our continuous posture management. So again, if you're in Defender, you may already be quite familiar with the vulnerability assessment tools. You could also be using something like a Tenable, things like that. We don't often see it, or at least lesser implemented on our infrastructure side, looking at our code, looking at our servers. So one of the things we want to do is have that dashboard, that visibility we get on the endpoint side, also available to our infrastructure teams, right? So secure score, you're probably quite familiar here about that quite a bit. Possibly identity secure score, what our endpoint secure score is. We want to know our secure score up in the cloud as well. So having that kind of advanced benchmark that we can weigh against. We also have a lot of assessment tools there, so we can do additional initiatives, so we can track how we're improving over time, how we're being efficient with our patching and things like that. The secure code remediations are coming out of our, not only Microsoft threat intelligence data, but also whatever policies we're following, right? If things fall out of compliance, we want to make sure we're aware of those. We get those warnings as well. If resources suddenly come out of date, we want to make sure those are updated as well. If we have regulatory compliance, if we're in an industry where we have to follow some certain compliance factors, HIPAA, PCI, whatever it is, we want to make sure those are always intact, right? That could be a legal issue if we let those fall out of line. So having our policies in place, having Defender Cloud monitor those for us, have those constantly updated and up to date with whatever the current standard is, and judged against our infrastructure, judged against our code, judged against our workloads is very beneficial to us to keep things maintained. And of course, continuous assessment is that it's always live. It's always doing an assessment. It's always looking at our services. So as soon as something drifts out, we're going to get an alert about it. And that way we can be quickly iterative, make sure we harden the areas that need to be hardened, and update as we go forward. So talk a little bit more about posture management here. Again, leaning into the compliance factors. If you have alignment that you need to follow, or have some alignments that you particularly want to follow, CIS, NIST, HIPAA, I mentioned those, PCI SOC, all of those are available within Defender for Cloud. So as reference templates, you can load them up right away. Be able to see exactly how your infrastructure as it sits aligns to those standards, and also get the recommendations about how to correct them. These policies can also help us enforce deployment. So we can actually watch stuff and make sure that, hey, only these certain type of services can be deployed. We can't deploy A without B without C, right? All aligning to either these public templates that we have available, or even custom standards that you might bring to the fold here to align. The other thing is that we want to make sure we can assess the cloud risk. Often we can't always have agents on the endpoints, so our servers maybe, we can have some sort of endpoint protection, but we have other things like storage accounts, databases, we can't directly have an agent on them. So one of the benefits here is that Defender for Cloud runs in the infrastructure of Azure, right? So in the back plane there, it can continuously scan those workloads without interfering with them. So because it has a tap into that infrastructure, and even when we're connecting to multi-cloud, we still have that same backend and visibility. So we can have this kind of frictionless onboarding as we see here, without needing to wait for agents to roll out, without needing to rely on some sort of deployment process. As soon as that stuff's provisioned, it's being monitored, it's being protected, it's being held to our policies and our alignments. Um, just to bring us back kind of that Defender stack, we're talking about XDR. One of the things with posture management is we want to have that input feed into our security graph. I think we've heard several times. I think it comes up a lot nowadays. Is that IT groups tend to think in lists, attackers tend to think in graphs, meaning that they're going to jump around to various, whatever the easiest path of approach is for them to breach our services, right? So we want to have our cloud security, our application security feed into this graph so that we can monitor these things. So that way, when we're watching these things, we can get that attack surface management, not just on our EDR, not just on our identity platform, but in our cloud resources, in our server stack, in our applications, in our development cycle. So looking at that attack surface management, so let's expose the outside attack path analysis. If someone did get in, how could they move around the environment? Where potential pinch points that we could potentially harden up or lock down in a scenario, and then have this exposure insights feed into everything else we have going on in the environment, right? So not only need to watch maybe what's being patched on our endpoints, we need to know what version of code we're running on our servers, and how those integrate, and how those potentially could interleave with each other. So again, just harking back to this idea is that we want that information all brought together in one spot so we can make the appropriate correlations, make the appropriate remediations when needed. Third item here is our cloud workload protection. Probably the most straightforward part of this is the direct active protection of our resources. Maybe very straightforward being our server protection, right? So just running that EDR, but on our servers, maybe in a more strict fashion because we don't have end users on there necessarily. But this also extends out to other pieces of our infrastructure. So when we can also, provide direct real-time protection for containers, databases, storage. Also reaching into AI now, where we can provide protection against false prompts and prompt injection. This is more of the straightforward, let's roll this out for each of the resources we have. So this is where we detect suspicious activities. We're monitoring file activity, exploit attempts, access, reviews there. And we also have full control over it, just like we do on the endpoints, right? So our servers might have a different context of what they can run, and who can log into them, and have those tools set up to provide that constant protection. What's nice with Defender for Cloud, we can adjust our workload plans to enable those on different parts of our resources, right? So normally this can be enabled at the subscription level, or possibly even, if you want to get granular enough, you can do it down to the resource level. So you can really pick and choose where you need that protection, where you might not have it, or maybe you have another tool involved. Maybe an area that's development only, where you have less of those tools in place. But again, trying to feed this into not only your budget, but also knowing where it's important to have these workload protections. So when we look at workload protections, we want to have multi-layered defenses, just like we do on our endpoints and the rest of our security stack. Again, kind of bring all this stuff together. We get those same tools. So if you're familiar with Defender, again, we're going to see a lot of the same resources, a lot of the same factors here. A couple of those being, everything in Microsoft security land is associated with the MITRE framework. So we always have that reference to work off of. That way you guys can be familiar with what kind of attacks are coming in, what kind of threats there are, different approaches, different strategies there. Microsoft Threat Intelligence is always at the forefront here. We know that from the endpoint side. The same threat intelligence is available to us up in Defender for Cloud, pointing at our server stack, and with server specific and application and development specific recommendations around that as well. Our cloud workload protection, again, solid there, staying in front of our adversary, built on the same core, at least on the server side for our endpoint protection, but extending, as I said, into these other resources or storage points, our network again, and AI coming here soon. And then the cloud detection response. This kind of brings it back to us having that single pane of glass, right? When we have this integration where we can pull this information together, have all the alerts come to one spot, that means we have a single place to triage. We're not jumping around to multiple, portals or panels trying to figure out what's going on. It's all together, and XDR can do that correlation for us. Really tell us the attack story, perhaps even before anything is seriously damaged and can be stopped in that regard. So when we do have our cloud protection in place, we have our workloads. APIs are also a newer factor there for us to have protections around. So as we have more development based deployments, we want to make sure our API is protected, that are being used correctly, and that the data there is protected. I mentioned the integration there for like Purview and some of the data loss prevention. That's all integrated here with Defender for Cloud as part of those workload protections. So if we have storage accounts, if we have databases, these are places where we're going to want to put these in, right? Each resource type, is protected against its unique, attack approaches. Databases are going to have, injection protection. We're going to looking at storage, scanning those files, looking for issues there. Open ports, of course, across all the resources. And then when we have those policies in place, as soon as we bring those workloads online, they get protected. They get that policy applied to them. Makes it again, so that shift left idea is that we don't deploy anything without it already being aligned to our standard. So again, stepping off with the appropriate settings and consistent settings for every time we do it is very important. And then finally here on our workload protection, we want to make sure that we go beyond protection. Can't just be responsive only. We want to make sure that we can respond to threats across the enterprise, right? So this, if you're familiar with Defender, this screenshot should look quite familiar to you. This gives us the whole attack tree, the attack story of when our events correlate. So if we have alerts coming in from our endpoints, if we have alerts coming in from our devices, integrating Defender for Cloud gives us those alerts and the telemetry and correlation that gives us that full attack story. While we may be thinking about, hey, we want to protect our endpoints, we want to protect our servers, the attackers are thinking about, hey, where can I jump from one to the other? Possibly from an endpoint to some of our infrastructure, back out to devices, whatever the easiest path there. And we have to have all those points coming in order to provide that protection. If you're asking what can we protect with Defender for Cloud, workload protection is actually getting pretty broad across the board here. On the compute side, we can really handle any server. That's a pretty broad statement, but that's because we can't connect them with Azure Arc. Azure Arc is, if you're not familiar, the agent that connects systems to the Azure management plane. So that could be your on-prem systems, could be in a colo, could be hosted for you. This is also how we connect other cloud services. So systems that we might have living in, third-party hosting services, we can connect them back to the Azure management plane with Azure Arc and bring them into Defender for Cloud so we can watch them all. So that's how we get coverage over, any server, Azure VMs, of course, natively, but also anything like Kubernetes or Amazon resources, as well as Google compute sources as well. On the service layer, we're going to be watching, our background services as well. So we have workload protections around Azure DNS, our Key Vault, our network layers, of course. Resource management, meaning the underlying structure of Azure, so ARM, if you're familiar with that. And of course, API management as well. So if you're developing and using APIs, you have the workload protections there as well. On the storage side, we get full coverage. Mostly from file and data storage through our databases, of course, right? So blob storage, file storage, of course, and your host of database flavors that you might be running as part of your main platforms. Relatively new is our AI workload protection as well. Azure AI, so if you're developing there using Azure AI or some of its model tools and things like that. So whether you're using Foundry or developing on your own, there we can use those workload protections to help monitor access, how it's being used, prompt injection, as I said, so we can monitor what's being put into the AI and the response we're getting as well. So relatively new protection for what is becoming a new threat nowadays. The fourth item on our list was talking about that little bit more about that shift left security concept, right? Shift left is looking for these potential threats, but looking for vulnerabilities in the pipeline before stuff even gets deployed, right? So this could be development cycles within our dev teams, but even even if you're not developing in house, this is if you're doing infrastructure as code, if you're rolling services out for your internal users. Um, Codifying this and having it prepped beforehand is that shift left mentality. Have the stuff defended before it goes out. So our security teams need to work more hand in hand with our infrastructure, so that and our development teams as well, so that it's not a after the fact thought, right? So this is why we can shift left, get these things to front of house, have Defender for Cloud integrate with that those DevOps processes, so that they can have those security checks, so they can have those alignments well early in that process, making sure that they're aware of it, that the lifecycle continues on in that regard. So again, addressing issues early minimizes operational drag. Of course, we know that. It's always going to be the fight of, hey, do we deploy and then we find an issue, we got to roll back, go forward. We want to continuously iterate. We want to improve those security stances. We want to improve those standards as we go forward. So, talking a little bit more about the shift left idea here. With Defender for Cloud, we can unify our visibility into the application security posture. So when we look at these things, this ties directly into GitHub, Azure DevOps, or GitLab if you're using those services, and can trigger automated processes when we run pipelines, when we do fresh deployments, when we do any sort of iteration on the environment or any of our services. Um, includes, as you see here, code scanning, secret scanning, making sure that things written out, open source dependency scanning, so vulnerability assessments on any sort of dependencies that we might be using as part of our code, certainly integrated as part of that. So again, even before we even roll the stuff out, it's going to check that back and make sure that everything we're using is safe, everything that we're using is secured, before it rolls out. So that integration really makes this happen. If we're doing infrastructure as code, we want to make sure we strengthen that as well. Some other tools we have as part of Defender for Cloud is looking for those misconfigurations in infrastructure. Kind of standard policies that we might use, or just standard reference templates that we have. Really looking to say, hey, is this configured correctly when it's being deployed? Is it set to our benchmark that we have to hold our standard to, right? Is this being set up in the best way possible? And this allows us to integrate this into that infrastructure as code mentality, where we have again iterative improvement. With the multi-cloud support, it's just not just Azure, because we do have cross-platform support here. So ARM, of course, Azure Resource Manager, but also Bicep, Helm, CloudFormation, Terraform. If you're using any of those cover the most standard IAC setups. We're going to be able to integrate that here with Defender for Cloud and have it, provide those protections for us as we roll things out. We also want to prevent recurring risks, so code to cloud remediation. So again, we don't want to fix things in production and just have a quick patch or something like that. We want to make sure that gets iterated back into the source. That way we can re-roll things out. So when we have code to cloud contextualization, it's automatically traces to make sure that that code is out of the system, that everything is updated appropriately. We can also use that to identify our attack path. So looking again at those open source vulnerabilities, if there's any credentials in the environment, again, harking it back to the DevOps so that it gets corrected at the source rather than sort of as a fix out on production. And then finally, just wanted to double down on the multi-cloud visibility and operational capabilities here at Defender for Cloud. Even though this is an Azure service, it does fully integrate for AWS and Google Cloud. Certainly, a lot of our clients are running multi-cloud. It's a good strategy to have. We don't know, when there's ever, going to be big outages here or there. So having your resources spread across is a benefit in that regard. It does add a lot of complexity, of course, right? Especially on the security side. If you're dealing with multiple identity sources, if you're dealing with multi-platforms, again, multiple portals. When we can bring this all back into Defender for Cloud, have our security response be isolated to a single portal, and have all of our things held to the same reference points, all held to the same benchmarks, the same policies, the same vulnerability assessments that we have out of Defender for Cloud, really makes our job on the security side a lot easier. Again, integrating into our DevOps, this is, regardless of where the code is being deployed to, we can have the same standards applied to it. Make sure that, hey, if we're rolling this out into Azure or if we're rolling this out into Amazon, it's going to have the same level of protection, the same workload protections, the same settings and preventative measures and monitoring as well. So again, just want to note, this is really built to integrate fully, regardless of whatever cloud you're sitting in. So you can even approach this even if you aren't using Azure already. It's meant to fit in and pull those resources in. All right, I'll turn this back over to Chris then for the remainder.
All right, thanks, Jeff, for that level of detail and the overview of Defender for Cloud. Appreciate it. So we're going to round things out just talking about some kind of real world scenarios based on kind of the 5 key points that Jeff was mentioning and features around Defender for Cloud. Kind of understand what that might look like from an attack kill chain perspective with some illustrative scenarios, and then we can talk about adoption around Defender for Cloud and potential next steps as well. So we'll jump into that. Again, really just going to hit these 3 areas from this perspective. So we'll take a look at those scenarios, talk about adoption, and then our recommended next steps here. So we'll move ahead there. Sorry. One of the key areas again that we've been talking about is kind of misconfigurations potentially. At the beginning of the process or development process, we talked about things like infrastructure as a code, um, having that shift left mentality. So our first example here really focuses on that. So if we move forward, we have the visual example of thinking about with cloud native adoption, we have these infrastructure as a code templates, right? These templates could be available from a public perspective. They could also be calling other open source tools that haven't been vetted. So I think just a few minutes ago, we saw Jeff kind of give an overview of how there's some vulnerability scanning capabilities for these exact areas. So the scenario that's kind of outlined here is, there's potential risk in these infrastructure for code components, misconfigurations, injected code, possibly like excessive permissions. So once these are brought into your development pipeline, right, they might have access to sensitive data from a threat perspective. Accessing kind of a lateral movement from that perspective with the misconfigurations in the code, it could deploy paths for malware and other attack vectors. So really the key piece here is thinking about how do we address this from the beginning perspective, which would be excuse me, assessing the infrastructure as a code for vulnerabilities, also looking at overall cloud security posture management on those potentially affected resources. Could be servers, could be storage, as we mentioned. So we have visibility into all those different areas. So really, Defender for Cloud can help directly with this scenario, but thought this was a pretty good example of the potential of malicious code that can be injected into the process and how that might look from a kill chain perspective in this scenario. So the next one that we have illustrated is another interesting example of all the different kind of signals we've been talking about. It goes back to my kind of zero trust comments on thinking about these different pillars, these different areas of threat vectors, if you will. We have identity signals here on the left that are detecting, malicious content potentially. So is the administrative portals or sign-in logs showing that these are coming from a common, malicious set of IPs, right? That have been known for password spray attacks. In this example, particularly, are we seeing other signals across Defender for Identity as well? So when we were talking about Defender XDR, there's a lot of components, not even just Defender for Cloud, that could be involved here as well. So we have Defender for Identity, looking for malicious actions in Active Directory and authentication specifically around that. We have Defender for Endpoint. We have Defender for Office, looking for email protection. So all these are that XDR mentality, right? Having extended detection and response across these areas. So in this example, right, we're getting signals from the sign-in logs itself and Defender for Cloud Apps, maybe Enter ID in this case. We're seeing signals from Defender for Identity of unfamiliar sign-in properties. And then Defender XDR overall is looking at, a risk level, kind of putting together an incident from that component. So what we kind of have illustrated here is a potential compromise of an identity can lead to something very interesting in this scenario of usually a term called like cryptojacking, if you will. So you have the lateral movement of a compromised identity that gets you into the backend resources. If we're talking about Azure, right, from a administrative permissions perspective, and now potentially resources are being spun up without administrative insight into this, right? So in this example, this could be like crypto mining type of resources being spun up in your own environment. We take signals from Defender for Cloud to see, those malicious actions on the virtual machines themselves, or even the governance around those that we've talked about. What are these kind of outlier type of signals that are being correlated across the different areas in this timeline to kind of give us that full picture. So feel this is a pretty good example, just a single example specific around that cryptojacking, if you will, but kind of represents, you can see all the different threat vectors across the kill chain and how that could lead to compromise in this case. So if we move on, there's just a more high-level illustrative example of all the different components we've talked about. So really at the high level, we've talked about cloud security posture management, kind of the foundational pieces of Defender for Cloud. Then we get into more of the specific modules or capabilities, right? We're focusing on storage, we're focusing on Defender for servers, on your server infrastructure, containers, IoT, AI components. So really want to look across all those different domains, to get that big picture from that perspective. So that represents, if we move forward there, sorry. Hopefully that gives everyone kind of a good overview of understanding of where Defender for Cloud could fit in your environment. Also, how, if you have Defender XDR and those components in your environment, we can start to see how all those different areas are related across those different technology domains. So from an adoption perspective, there's a lot of options here, even just understanding kind of what the baseline looks like from an assessment standpoint as one route to start with, right? Understanding the workloads, the cloud workloads that you have, type of governance capabilities, identifying gaps around there, identifying your overall posture. Each one of the areas, again, with Defender for Cloud, there's kind of the foundational pieces I mentioned, right? Getting the subscription up and running, getting those foundational CSPM components in place. There's different assessments that Jeff was mentioning as well that can be run pretty much right away. And then you could have focused pilots on, specific areas. So if it's Defender for servers, Defender for IoT, Defender for containers, Defender for storage, whatever it may be, you can pilot those features with a subset of your resources and start to understand, what a full integration could look like. So lots of different ways to look at adoption there from that perspective. And then if we move forward there. So again, kind of leading to some recommended next steps. So we commonly have definitely more cloud assessments around as one of the first steps. So kind of taking a step back, gathering as much information as possible to kind of see where these tools will fit, within your environment. What are the third-party tools you have in your environment? How those signals are correlated or potentially not correlated. You can also, really just understand overall workflow within your teams from the administrative side, on the development side, how that relates to what a deployment of Defender for Cloud and these related tools would look like. You kind of continue to build the posture in phases, if you will, right, to get to a better state. That's overall, from that perspective, is a good way to look at it. So hopefully, including this webinar, kind of help you understand maybe where that starting point is for you. Everyone's kind of at a different stage. Maybe uh, some users are already, piloting Defender for Cloud capabilities. Maybe you have other different third-party tooling that overlaps with its capabilities. So we're definitely here to help with all those different scenarios. And then specifically, some of the key offerings that we have, one of the main ones is a cloud security envisioning workshop. So this is a Microsoft funded workshop where you can choose the different modules that make sense. It's kind of a good starting point. So there's a couple key areas for it. It is fully focused on Defender for Cloud, but you'll also get an understanding of Defender XDR overall, right? If it goes into the Microsoft 365 side, like we mentioned, or focusing on Defender for Cloud specifically, and even identity components. So really a good, thorough kind of understanding of all those different domains that we were talking about. But the workshop itself, again, fully funded by Microsoft, and you'll have the foundational modules that are included, and then you can also choose which modules of interest to you. So if a Defender for Storage is a main interest, you can choose a few different modules that are available within the workshop. And then it generally typically takes about a month's time. So we're happy to go into detail on that, from a contact perspective. We have the ability to check to see if your organization is eligible for the workshop. So most organizations should be, but we can verify that completely by reaching out to us. And then you can see, what type of modules fit with what you're looking for from that envisioning workshop. Um, Also, one area is the Office of the CTO. So we kind of have a unique team that I'm part of. We're all previous delivery engineers, long tenure, boots on the ground that have moved into more of the advisory role here. And we can have these, high level architecture design discussions around security, in my case, or around any of the other pillars, around technology and the Microsoft services as well, and really help you kind of jump in and kind of understand at a strategic level which direction you want to go, and take into all those accounts of not just saying, all right, we're going to have a conversation about security, but what about all these other different areas and how they're related ultimately to what we're trying to do. So along with that, there's cloud professional services. We also offer cloud managed services. Briefly mentioned, kind of related topic. We do a lot of tenant to tenant migrations, right? If it's Microsoft to Microsoft, could be Google to Microsoft, could be other third-party sources to Microsoft, or vice versa. But a lot of that involves, infrastructure and what we're talking about. So having kind of the security design around that as part of even like a divestiture scenario, as I mentioned early on, becomes part of that overall planning, and we can definitely help with that. And then we have at a high level overall vCISO services. So from having an entire advisory team from that strategic planning level that can help with regulatory assessments, cloud assessments in general, as mentioned, or very specific even app assessments and penetration testing, internal external pen testing. So we have whole offensive security team as well. So lots of areas we can definitely help out with. Kind of key part is understanding maybe that what that starting point is, if it's going to be a workshop or maybe an assessment, or at least just a conversation with, say, our Office of the CTO team, to kind of see where that leads. So with that said, I don't think we have any questions in the chat. Is that correct, Jeff?
Yeah, let's see so far.
Okay. So definitely open it up for questions. Let's see if anyone had any questions.
And if not any questions now, I'll certainly open it up to say that you're always welcome to send us a message. We'll happily respond, follow up with you on any questions. So if you're watching this after the fact, not live, certainly reach out to us with any questions, anything that came up during the webinar. We'll happily give you a response back.
All right. With that, doesn't sound like we have any questions. Again, contact us at info@netrixglobal.com. Be happy to reach out. Thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks, everybody.